The Duke of Renmore crossed his own snowbound forecourt at midnight to shut a banging gate, and found a woman folded into the drift beneath it, one bare hand still reaching for the latch as though she had meant to let herself in, and simply forgotten how to finish the thought. He had been told to expect a governess on the evening coach. He had not been told she would arrive half-frozen and 3 hours past hope, and so when he knelt and she lifted her face to the small flame he carried, he said the only name he had been holding all day, and she, too cold to argue with a warm voice, did not tell him it was the wrong one. The candle was the first thing she truly saw. Not the great dark house behind him, not the iron gates, not the gold of the carriage lantern swinging from his other hand, only the single beeswax candle in its tarnished pewter chamberstick, sheltered against the wind by the curve of his glove. Its flame bent almost flat and refusing, stubbornly, to go out. He held it toward her the way a man holds out a hand to something that might bolt, and she watched it instead of him. "Miss Pemberton," he said again, and there was relief in it, and a flicker of reproof for the lateness, and under both a kindness she had not heard aimed at her in longer than she could measure. "Good God! How long have you been at that gate?" She tried to say that her name was Clara. She tried to say Ainsworth. The word came apart in her mouth into a sound that was mostly breath, and he took it for assent, and that was the moment. She would think later that the lie was born, not from her cunning, but from her exhaustion and his certainty, which between them made a thing neither had chosen. "Never mind. Don't talk." He set the lantern in the snow. He worked his greatcoat off his own shoulders in 2 hard movements and put it around hers, and the wool came down over her like a roof, smelling of wood smoke and bergamot and horse, and she nearly wept at the warmth of another person's body still held in cloth. "Can you stand? Lean on me. The house is closer than it looks. It is always closer than it looks. That is its single mercy." Her name was Clara Ainsworth, and she was 22, and until 11 months ago she had been the daughter of a gentleman. With a pianoforte she played indifferently, and a father she loved, and a future so unremarkable she had never once thought to be grateful for it. Then her father's man of business had proved cleverer than her father, and the entail had proved crueler than anyone, and by the time the lawyers were done, there had been a list. The house, the pianoforte, the small income, the name of a married cousin who would not answer letters. And Clara had become a woman who slept in coaching inns when she could afford them, and in barns when she could not, carrying references that grew softer at the folds from being shown, walking the last miles to positions that were always, somehow, just filled. The position at Renmore was not hers. She knew that even as the Duke half carried her up the steps. She knew it as one knows a sum is wrong before the error is found. She had heard the name in the taproom of the inn at Marrow Cross 2 days back, where the carrier had said the Duke of Renmore was wanting a governess for the little motherless girl up at the hall, and good luck to whoever took it, the child not having spoken above 10 words since the funeral. And something in Clara, some compass she did not trust and could not switch off, had turned her feet north toward a house that did not want her, because a part of her that she kept folded very small had wanted, just once, to be walked toward a fire instead of away from a door. So she did not correct him. Tell yourself it was the cold. The cold is the easiest thing to blame, and the most honest and the least complete. If you have ever been the person at the door, the one the room is deciding about, the one whose welcome depends on a mistake or a mercy you did not earn and cannot explain, then you already know the particular ache of this house, and you already belong here. This channel is for the overlooked one, the plain one, the ruined one, the one taken for a servant in someone else's snow. Take a moment to subscribe and pull your own chair to the fire, because the kind of love I tell here is the kind that chooses exactly that person, slowly and on purpose, and does not take it back, and Clara's is only beginning. Inside, the hall swallowed them whole, a vast wood-paneled cavern with a staircase that climbed into the dark and a fire at the far end like a small civilization, and Clara, set into a wing chair before it, with the Duke's coat still on her shoulders, was given back the candle to hold while the household was woken. She held it in both hands against her chest. It was hers for the moment. He had put it into her hands, and she gripped it, as though someone might at any instant remember themselves and take it back along with everything else. A boy was sent running for the housekeeper. The housekeeper came, Mrs. Holland, stout and gray, and tying her cap as she walked, and she took one look at the snow melting off the stranger's hem and stopped being asleep entirely. The poor creature. On the coach was she, and it never came past the village. Tom said the road was shut at the ford. She crouched by the chair, brisk and warm, chafing Clara's hands around the candle. "You're safe now, miss. You're at Renmore, and there's not a draught in this hall the master won't have stopped on before he sleeps." "Pemberton," said the Duke, by way of introduction, with the air of a man relieved to have a problem solved before it had properly begun. "The governess. 3 hours in a snowdrift, Mrs. Holland. I want her warmed and fed and put somewhere with a fire, and I want the gate seen to before it kills the next fool who trusts it." And up on the landing, through the carved balusters of the great staircase, a child was watching. Clara saw her before either of the others did, a thin small shape in a white nightgown and a quilted robe, dark ringlets, a face too solemn for its years, a worn cloth doll held against her chest in the same clenched grip with which Clara was holding the candle. The girl did not call out. She did not run to anyone. She simply watched with the still, total attention of a creature deciding whether the new thing in its territory was a danger. And her eyes went from the Duke to the housekeeper, to the stranger by the fire, and stopped there on Clara, on the candle, and narrowed. Not in dislike, but in a kind of grave arithmetic. Children know. That is the thing about children, and about old grooms, and about horses. They read the truth of a person from below the level where grown people keep their manners, and they are very rarely wrong, and they cannot be reasoned out of what they have already decided. The girl on the stairs had not spoken above 10 words since they had buried her. "Mother!" She looked at the woman who was holding the candle the way a drowning thing holds driftwood, and something in her own folded small place recognized something in Clara's, and she did not yet come down. But she did not go back to bed either. She sat on the cold top step and watched the fire warm a stranger, and she waited. They put her in a small chamber on the second floor, with a coal fire already lit, and a bed that had been someone's once, and was now, by accident, hers. Mrs. Holland brought broth and bread and a nightgown of plain good linen, and stood over Clara until she had eaten, and took the Duke's greatcoat away over her arm, with a tenderness that suggested she would brush the snow from it herself, rather than give it to a maid. "He gave you his coat," the housekeeper said at the door half to herself in the tone of a woman noting a thing for later. "Well, he would. He's a good man under all that quiet, whatever the county says of him." And she left the candle, Clara's candle, the gate candle, burning on the washstand, and went out, and shut the door, on the first warm night Clara Ainsworth had known since the world ended. Clara did not sleep at once. She sat up against the bolster and watched the candle and tried to make herself say, even alone, even to the dark, the sentence she would have to say in the morning. "My name is not Pemberton. I am not your governess. There has been a mistake, and it is mine, and I will walk back to the village as soon as the road opens." The sentence was simple. It was true. It was the only decent thing. And every time she shaped it, the candle threw its small steady light across the room, and she thought of the warmth of the coat and the relief in his voice, and the child on the stairs with the doll, and the sentence would not come, because to say it was to choose the snow, and she had been choosing the snow for 11 months, and she was so tired of being the one who did the decent thing and walked away. "I'll tell him in the morning," she told the candle. The candle, which knew better, said nothing, and burned down a little, and kept her company until she slept. Morning at Renmore came gray and late and absolute, the snow gone on through the night, until the park was one unbroken sheet and the windows furred white at the corners. Clara woke to cold daylight and a banked fire, and the candle guttered to a stub on the sill, and for one merciful instant she did not remember where she was. And then she remembered all of it at once, and lay very still under the strange warm weight of a real coverlet and thought, "Today I undo it." She rose. She pressed her hand to the frozen glass and looked out over a buried world, in which no road was visible and no coach could come, and understood, with a lurch that was not entirely dismay, that she was not going anywhere today, nor likely tomorrow, and that whatever she was going to confess would have to be confessed inside a house she could not yet leave. She dressed in her own plain dove-gray muslin, which Mrs. Holland's maid had dried and pressed overnight to a respectability it had not owned in months, and pinned up her dark auburn hair, and went down to find that the household had already decided who she was, and had built her a place in it overnight while she slept. There was a schoolroom. There was a child who would not look at her. There was a slate, and a cold hearth, and a shelf of worn books, and the thin, solemn girl from the stairs sitting at a little table in a gray day dress with the cloth doll on her lap, regarding the wall with the steady refusal of someone who has learned that the surest way to lose nothing further is to want nothing at all. Mrs. Holland made the introduction in a careful, bright voice. "Lady Beatrice, here is Miss Pemberton, come to be your governess. Bea, love, say good morning." Bea did not say good morning. Bea looked at Clara, one long gray measuring look, doll to candle, drowning thing to driftwood, and then looked back at the wall, and the housekeeper sighed the sigh of a woman who has tried this before with others, and watched them fail, and murmured, on her way out, that the child would come round in her own time, or she wouldn't, and either way the master had said to try. Clara stood in the cold schoolroom and looked at the back of a 7-year-old's head and felt the false name settle over her shoulders, like the borrowed coat, warm and stolen, and impossible now to take off in front of this child without explaining a betrayal too large for the room. So she did not begin with letters. She set the slate aside. She crossed to the cold hearth and knelt and began, without a word, to lay a fire, kindling, coal, the small competent movements of a woman who had learned in barns to make warmth out of almost nothing. And she did not look at the girl at all, and she said to the grate in an even voice, "I am not very good at being a governess. I had better tell you that at the start, so you are not disappointed in me by luncheon. But I am very good at being cold, and I am very good at fires. And I find that the second is more useful than the first more often than anyone admits." There was a silence. Then a small voice, rusty from long disuse, said from behind her, "You held the candle wrong. Last night, you held it like it was going to run away." Clara did not turn around. She was afraid that if she turned around the girl would stop. "I have not had a candle of my own in a long time," she said to the fire. "I have got out of the habit of trusting that they stay." Another silence, longer. The fire caught and breathed and put out its first real heat into the cold room. And then there was the soft scrape of a small chair, and the whisper of a too large dressing gown, and the girl came and sat down on the hearthstone beside her. Not close, a careful arm's length. The exact distance, Clara would later learn, this whole house kept from one another, and set the cloth doll on the warm stone between them, and said, "Mama held them like that, at the end, like they were going to run away." And then, after a while, in the smallest voice of all, "Did yours die too?" And Clara Ainsworth, kneeling on a cold hearth in a house under a false name, with a child she had been hired by mistake to teach, understood that she had walked north for exactly this, and that the decent thing and the true thing had just become, terribly, the same impossible sentence, and that she was not, after all, going to say it today. "No," Clara said, "mine did not die. Mine was lost a different way. But I know the holding on you mean." And she picked up the cloth doll from the warm stone and looked at its stitched face with grave courtesy, as one is introduced to a person of consequence, and asked its name, and Bea told her it was Mrs. Tibbs, and that Mrs. Tibbs was very brave, and had no opinions she was afraid to share. And Clara said that those were the best sort of friend to have in a cold house, and the morning, somehow, was begun. They did not do letters that first day, nor much the second. What they did was tend fires and name the portraits in the upstairs corridor, and decide, between them, which of Clara's barnyard skills were worth a governess knowing, how to keep your feet from freezing by wriggling your toes inside your boots, which Bea practiced solemnly under the schoolroom table, how to make a single candle last a whole long evening by trimming the wick close, which Clara demonstrated with the gate candle that had somehow become hers, and traveled now from room to room in her hand. By the third day, Bea had begun to follow her, at the careful arm's length, from breakfast to schoolroom, to the long gallery where they walked, when the rooms grew too cold to sit in, and the household, watching, began to speak of the new governess in the warm tones a house reserves for a thing that is working. The Duke watched too. Clara felt it before she saw it. The particular weight of being observed by someone who does not wish to be caught at it, and turned one gray afternoon to find him in the schoolroom doorway, half in shadow, his composed face arranged into something that was not quite a frown, watching his niece guide a stranger's hand to the right word on a slate. He had the grace to look faintly caught. He came no further than the threshold. "She is speaking," he said, as though the fact required confirmation aloud. "Mrs. Holland tells me she has said more this week than since." He did not finish. He did not say since the funeral. The unfinished sentence stood in the cold doorway between them, and Clara understood that this was a house in which the largest things were always the unfinished sentences, and that the Duke of Renmoor was a man who had a great many of them, and no one to whom he could say their ends. "Children speak when they are not being watched for it," Clara said. "She is not performing for me. I require nothing of her she cannot give, and so she finds she can give a little more than nothing. It is not a method, Your Grace. It is only patience, which looks like a method from the doorway." He considered this. He was, she would learn, and who considered things, who let a remark sit and turned it over before he answered it, so that his silences felt less like coldness than like respect. "You speak more plainly than the last three," he said at last, and there was the dry flicker of something at the corner of his mouth that, in a warmer man, might have been a smile. "They told me what I wished to hear. You tell me what is the case. I find I prefer it, though I did not expect to." And he inclined his head to her, to the governess, to a woman he believed to be a paid servant in his house, with a courtesy he need not have spent, and went away down the corridor. And Clara stood with the chalk in her hand and the false name in her mouth, and felt the particular misery of being respected for a virtue while concealing a deceit. This was the trouble with Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Renmoor, and Clara saw it clearly within a week. He was kind. Not kind as the world counted it, with subscriptions to charities and a benevolent word at Christmas, but kind in the grain of him, in the small unwitnessed places, kind to the groom's rheumatism, kind to the spinster aunt who ran his table, kind to the half-frozen woman at his gate, to whom he owed nothing and gave his coat. The county, Mrs. Holland had said, thought him cold, because grief had made him quiet, and quiet in a duke is mistaken for pride. But he was not cold. He had simply lost a brother and a sister-in-law inside a single dreadful winter, Lord Edmund and his wife both, of the same fever, within a fortnight of each other, and been left with a title he had not wanted and a child who would not speak, and a house full of unfinished sentences, and he had met all of it with a composure the world read as indifference, and Clara was beginning to read as the discipline of a man holding a great deal of grief very still, so that it would not frighten a little girl. She should not have liked him. It made everything harder. A cruel master she could have deceived with a clear conscience and left without a backward glance. A foolish one she could have managed, but a good man mistaken. A good man who lifted servants from carriages himself and gave away his coat and respected plain speech and grieved in silence so a child need not see it. A good man deceived was a wound she was opening a little wider every day she did not confess, and she knew it, and she stayed. The aunt was another matter. Lady Margaret Ashcombe ran the household with the cool competence of a woman who had managed grander ones, and she did not believe in Clara from the first. It was nothing so vulgar as cruelty. It was worse, it was attention. Where the others saw a governess and a small daily miracle, Lady Margaret saw a young woman whose dove-gray muslin had been good muslin once, and whose plain speech was a shade too educated, whose hands knew fires but whose vowels knew Latin, and who carried herself, even in a borrowed life, like someone who had been somebody. She summoned Clara to the drawing-room on the fourth evening, sat very straight in plum silk among the gilt and the candlelight, and asked her, in a voice like cool water, exactly nothing that a governess would mind, and everything that a fraud would dread. Where had Miss Pemberton been before? What was her family? Whether she had references, and from whom, and might Lady Margaret see them? "They were in my trunk," Clara said, which was true, and my trunk did not come past the ford, which was also true, and I will send for them when the road opens, which was a lie wearing the clothes of a promise. And she met the older woman's eyes while she said it, because she had learned that the only way to carry a deceit with dignity is to refuse to be ashamed in the moment, and to save the shame for later alone, where it could do its work without giving her away. Lady Margaret let the silence stretch. She was not cruel. She was not even unkind. She was only unconvinced, and she had the grace and the cunning to let Clara feel it without ever saying a word that could be answered. "You manage my great niece remarkably," she said at last, rising, the audience over. "I will say that for you, whoever you are." And the whoever you are hung in the candlelit air long after she had gone, gentle as a blade, and Clara carried her candle up to bed that night, knowing that there was at least one person under this roof who had already half guessed that the governess was not the governess, and who was waiting, with a patience equal to Clara's own, to find out what she was instead. If you have come this far into Clara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It was the horse that began the unraveling, and it began it by nearly ending worse. There was a black carriage horse at Renmore, a great powerful animal with a white blaze and a temper made of weather, and an old groom named Hollis, who was the only man it trusted, and who spoke of it as other men spoke of difficult relations, with exasperation and deep loyalty in equal measure. On the sixth morning, Bea, who had been told a dozen times to keep clear of the stable yard, slipped down to it at first light, because she had heard the horse was off its feed, and wished, in the new and dangerous way she had begun to wish for things again, to bring it an apple. Clara found the child gone from the schoolroom and the side door ajar, and ran out into the snow with her heart in her throat, and came into the cobbled yard to a scene she would dream of for weeks. The great black horse reared and screaming, hooves cutting the gray air, Hollis at its head hauling on the headstall with all his old weight, and Bea, small, frozen, an apple fallen from her open hand, standing directly inside the arc of those descending hooves, too terrified to move. Clara did not think. Thinking would have been slower than what her body did, which was to cross the yard in 3 strides and snatch the child sideways into the snow, rolling so that her own back took the cobbles, and her own arms caged the small shape against her. And the hooves came down a hand's breadth from where Bea had stood, and Hollis, with a sound torn out of him, got the brute's head down and dragged it back. And then there was only the steam of the horse's breath and the child's wild sobbing, and Clara on her back in the snow holding her, saying nothing, only holding, while the world rang. The Duke came at a run, coatless, white. He had heard the scream from the house, and in the moment he came through the stable arch, and saw his niece alive, and his governess on the ground, with her arm bleeding where a hoof had grazed it, and the child clamped to her chest. Something happened in his composed face that Clara had not seen there before and would not forget. The discipline broke, just for an instant, just long enough for her to see the depth of the fear it had been holding still. And then he was on his knees in the snow with both of them, his hands going over Bea, over Clara, over the bleeding arm, and his voice, when it came, was not the Duke's voice at all but a man's. "She is all right. You are all right. You are both." He stopped. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had put her own body between his last living family and a thing that could have killed them both, and the unfinished sentence this time finished itself in the look, and neither of them said the word for it, because it was too soon and too large, and she was lying to him, but it was there in the snow, and they both felt it cross the cold air between them like heat. "Asleep at the reins, the lot of us," Hollis muttered, gentling the trembling horse, shaken to his old bones. "Beg pardon, your grace, but that's God's truth. I'd the gate latch off and the yard open, and never thought the little lady—" He could not finish either. It was that kind of house. They carried Bea in. Clara walked, refusing the Duke's arm with a composure that cost her, because to lean on him, then bleeding, with the child's safety still ringing through all of them, was to take something she had not earned under a name that was not hers, and she would not. She had her own legs. She had still that. The dignity of a woman who has lost everything is sometimes only the dignity of refusing the one thing she most wants to accept, and Clara walked into the great hall on her own 2 feet, with her arm wrapped in Hollis's neckcloth and her chin level. And Mrs. Holland clucked and wept and dressed the wound, and the Duke stood by saying little, and watching her with the look of a man recalculating, from the ground up, everything he thought he knew. That night the fever came for the child. It was the cold of the snow, or the shock, or only the ordinary cruelty of a hard winter on a small frame. The apothecary, fetched at great difficulty across the frozen park, would not say which and could promise nothing. Bee burned. By midnight she was insensible, her dark ringlets soaked, her small hands plucking at the coverlid, and the house that had buried her mother and father within a fortnight, a year before, went gray and silent with an old remembered dread. Clara did not leave the bedside. No one suggested she should. Somewhere in the long, terrible day, the question of who Clara was had been suspended by the larger question of whether the child would live, and Clara sat through the dark with a cool cloth and the gate candle burning on the bedside table, doing the small, useless, tending things that are all anyone can do, while the fever ran its course and the candle burned down toward its socket. The Duke came at the turn of the night and did not leave either. He sat on the far side of the small bed in his shirt sleeves, his tailcoat thrown off, his dark hair wild, and across the sleeping, burning child, the two of them kept the watch together, hour on hour, passing the cloth, trimming the wick, saying almost nothing, while the candle that had stood between them at the gate stood between them again, lower now, a stub, its small flame the only steady thing in a room full of fear. Near 3 o'clock, when the child was at her worst, Clara saw the Duke's lips move and understood that the composed, dry-witted, irreligious man the county thought so cold was praying, silently, helplessly, his head bowed and his hands locked white on the edge of the bed, praying for the life of the one person he had left, and she looked away to give him the privacy of it and found that her own lips were moving too, and that she was asking the same dark for the same small life, and that somewhere in the long night their two silent prayers had become, without either of them saying so, a single one. The candle did not die. That was the thing Clara would remember. Near dawn, when the wick was a thread in a pool of melted wax and should by every law have guttered out, it steadied instead, stood up small and straight and golden in the gray light, and held, and at almost the same moment the child drew a long, different breath, and the awful heat broke under Clara's hand like a fever frost giving way, and Bea slept, truly slept, cool and quiet and alive. The Duke made a sound, he put his face in his hands, and Clara, weeping at last after a day of refusing to, reached across the sleeping child without thinking and put her hand over his bowed head, the same gesture of comfort she had given Bea, the one she had no right to make to a Duke and made anyway. And he turned his face up into the cold dawn light and looked at her, and she at him, and the unfinished sentence of the whole house hung between them, finally, almost spoken. She left it unspoken. She had to, because she was a fraud at his bedside, and a stranger at his hearth, and a woman with a false name on her tongue, and she could not let him say the word, or worse say it back, while she was still lying to him about the most basic fact of who she was. So she took her hand back gently, and looked at the candle instead, the steady saving candle, and said only, "She is past the worst. You should sleep, Your Grace. I will sit with her." And he did not sleep, but he let her have the lie of suggesting it, and the dawn came up gray and merciful over the snow, and downstairs, though none of them yet knew it, a coach had at last got through the thawing ford, and on it, 3 days late and entirely real, sat the genuine Miss Pemberton. Clara did not go down to the arrival. She knew nothing of it. When the child was deeply, safely asleep, and Mrs. Holland had come to take the chair, Clara went not to her own bed but down the cold back stair to the great library, because she could not have slept, and because a person who has sat all night beside a near-dying child needs, before she can be alone with herself, to stand in a large quiet room and be small in it. She took the candle. Of course she took the candle. It went where she went now. And she stood among the floor-to-ceiling books, in the gray first light, with the single flame throwing her shadow up the shelves. And she breathed, properly, for what felt like the first time in a day. That was when she saw the miniature. It stood on the library mantel among a row of small framed things, a gilt-edged oval, a painted face under glass, set a little apart, as though it had been moved there to be near the books and then half forgotten in the year of grief. Clara lifted her candle to it without much thought, the idle reverence one pays a stranger's dead, and then the light fell full on the painted face, and the breath went out of her entirely, and she had to put her free hand on the cold marble to stay standing. She knew that face, fair, gentle, gray-eyed, a soft mouth made for kindness. It was older here than Clara had known it, settled into the calm of a married woman, but it was the same face, unmistakably the same. And Clara's whole false-named borrowed life turned over on its axis in the cold library at dawn. The painted woman was Honoria Vane, that had been the gentlewoman in whose house Clara had spent the first 6 months of her own ruin, taken in as a companion when no one else would have her, taught by that very kindness how a woman might lose everything and keep her grace. The friend, the nearest thing to a friend, the 11 months had given her, who had gone away north to be married to a Lord Clara never met and whom Clara had grieved. In the small, folded way she grieved everything now. When the news came months later that Lady Edmund Ashcombe and her husband had died of a fever within a fortnight of one another and left a little girl behind, a little girl, Clara stood in the library and felt the whole thing assemble itself out of the dark like a building she had walked through blind. The carrier in the tap room at Marrow Cross, the Duke of Renmore wanting a governess for the little motherless girl up at the hall, the child not having spoken above 10 words since the funeral, and her own feet, which she did not trust and could not switch off, turning north, always north, toward a name she had told herself she did not recognize, toward the one house in England where a child was carrying the exact grief Clara carried, motherless and folded small, holding her candles like they were going to run away. She had not stumbled to Renmore's gate by accident. She had stumbled there by a longing she had refused to look at, walking half-knowing toward Honoria's child, toward the last warm trace of the one person who had been kind to her in her ruin. And the snow had only finished what her own heart had quietly begun. Bea was not the Duke's daughter. Clara understood that now too. Lord Edmund's child, his late brother's orphan, taken in by the surviving uncle along with the title and the silence. Bea was Honoria's daughter. The gray measuring eyes on the stairs the first night, the holding on, the candle held wrong at the end. They were Honoria's eyes, Honoria's child, and Clara had been put by mistake, or by something larger wearing the coat of a mistake, to teach and tend and pull, from under the hooves, the daughter of the only woman who had ever pulled Clara herself, from under the wheels of her own disaster. She sat down on the library steps with the candle in the miniature and wept. Not the silent, decent weeping she allowed herself, but something older and harder, grief and gratitude and terror, all at once, because the lie she had been carrying had just become 1,000 times heavier and 1,000 times more impossible to set down. She was not merely a fraud who had taken a governess's place. She was Honoria's, half sent here by Honoria's memory, and she had been lying about all of it. And she could not stay a single day longer without telling the truth, and she could not bear to tell the truth and be sent away from Honoria's child into the snow. "You found her," said a voice from the library door. The Duke stood there in the gray light, his shirt still open at the throat from the long night, his face gray with exhaustion and something else. He had not slept. He had come down, as she had, unable to be still, and found the governess on the library steps with his dead sister-in-law's portrait in her hands and tears on her face, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been quietly assembling a building of his own. "Your Grace," Clara began and could not go on. "You knew her." It was not a question. He came into the room slowly. "I have watched you a se'nnight reach a grief in that child no one in this house has reached, myself least of all. I told myself it was your patience. But it is not only patience, is it? You knew Edmund's wife." He stopped before her. "Tell me the truth. I find I have grown unable to do without it from you, which is an inconvenient thing to discover about a governess one knows nothing of." And Clara, with Honoria's painted face in her hands, and the candle steady on the step beside her, and a good man asking her plainly for the truth he's had, every right too, found that the sentence she had not been able to say for a week came out of her all at once, in the cold dawn library, with no cunning left in it at all. My name is not Pemberton. The room did not end. She made herself go on. It is Clara Ainsworth. I was a gentleman's daughter until a year ago. Then I was nothing. And then I was a woman walking from one closed door to the next. I was never engaged to be your governess. There was a mistake at the gate. You took me for her, and I was too cold and too tired and too long unwelcome to correct you, and I have let your whole house believe it for a week, and that is the lesser of the two things I have to confess. Her voice did not break, but it bent. The greater is this. I did not come to Renmore by chance. Your sister-in-law, Honoria, took me in when I was ruined and no one else would. She was the one kindness of the worst year of my life. When I heard on the road that her child lived here motherless, something in me that I did not let myself look at turned north and walked toward her. I told myself I was going nowhere. I was going here. The snow only made an accident of a thing my own heart had already chosen. So I am twice a fraud. Your Grace, a false governess and a woman who came to your gate half on purpose, and you may send me back to the village with my conscience, which I have earned, and I will not say a word against it. The silence in the library was very long. The Duke looked at her, at the woman who had put her body under the hooves, who had pulled his niece's grief up into the light, who had wept all night over a stranger's child and prayed beside him for a life, and who had now, given every reason and every opening to keep lying, told him the whole ruinous truth, standing in the cold, with no advantage left to her, and something moved in his composed face that was not anger. "Let me see that I have it entire," he said at last, slowly. "You were brought low through no fault of your own. You were given shelter by the kindest woman I ever knew, who is dead. When you learned her child was motherless, you came, not to deceive, but because the one person who had ever been kind to you had loved this child, and you could not stay away. And then, finding yourself taken for a servant, you spent a week loving that child back to speech, taking a horse's hoof for her, sitting a fever through, asking nothing, and your great crime, the thing you offer me your conscience over, is that you did all of it under the wrong name." He drew a breath. "Miss Ainsworth, I have been called the coldest man in the colonies for a year because I could not weep where my niece might see me. I think I know the difference between a fraud and a person doing the only warm thing left to them in a cold world. You are the second, and I find I am not interested in correcting the mistake." Clara stared at him. "Your Grace, you cannot keep a governess you know to be no governess." "I can do," said the Duke of Renmore, with the first full and unguarded smile she had seen on him, tired and certain and entirely kind. "Very nearly anything I please. It is the single advantage of the rank, and I have found distressingly little use for it until this morning. I took you for the governess in the snow. I have known for some minutes that you are not. And I am telling you, plainly, as you have asked everyone in this house all week to speak plainly, I do not mean to correct it. Stay, not as Pemberton, as yourself, Honoria's friend, and be as, and—" He stopped and let that sentence too go unfinished, but gently now, "as a door is left open, rather than as a thing that cannot be said. And we shall see what the rest of it is, when you are not half frozen and I am not half mad with the fright of nearly losing the both of you in one morning. It was not a proposal. It was too soon, and they were both too tired, and the child upstairs had only that hour come out of the fire, and neither of them was fool enough to mistake a dawn for a destination. But it was the opening of a door that the whole snowbound house had kept shut for a year, and Clara stood in the library with Honoria's face in her hands and a duke telling her to stay as herself, and understood that the longest walk of her life, 11 months of closed doors, of barns, of softening references, and the married cousin who would not write, had ended, by way of a mistake she had not quite made and a kindness she had not earned, at a fire that did not intend to send her back into the cold. She did not stay without a cost to her dignity, and she would not have respected herself if she had. There was the aunt to face, Lady Margaret, who had known all along that the governess was no governess, and who, when the truth was laid before her over a cool, careful breakfast, set down her cup and regarded Clara for a long moment and said only, "Honoria Vane's companion. Well, that accounts for the vowels." And then, after a silence in which a great deal was weighed, "I told my nephew you were not what you claimed, and I was right. and I have seldom been so glad to be right about so little. The child speaks. He smiles. You will send for those references, Miss Ainsworth, not because I doubt you now, but because a thing done properly is done properly. And then we shall say no more about Gates. It was as near to a welcome as Lady Margaret had it in her to give, and Clara, who had been braced for a blade, received it with the grace of a woman who knew exactly how much it had cost the older woman to bend, and was glad of it. And there was the real Miss Pemberton, Prudence Pemberton, prim and travel-worn, and entirely blameless, who had been 3 days frozen at the Shut Ford and arrived at last with her references in good order and her leather case under her arm to find the position she had been engaged for already filled by the woman who had been mistaken for her. It might have been ugly. It was the kind of circumstance that, in a crueler house or a crueler story, would have made an enemy. But Renmore was not that house. The Duke received Miss Pemberton with grave courtesy and a frankness that did her the honor of the truth, that there had been a confusion of the worst sort, that it was the house's fault and not hers, that her journey would be paid threefold, and a warm recommendation written to the excellent family in the next county who were, he happened to know, in want of exactly her steadiness. And Clara, who knew better than anyone in England what it was to arrive somewhere tired and find the door already shut, went herself to the bewildered woman and saw to it that she was warmed and fed and sent on not as a grievance but as a guest, so that the one person the mistake might have wronged was the one person sent away the better for it. Miss Pemberton, who had braced for humiliation and met kindness, left Renmore speaking well of it, and that, Clara thought, watching the coach go, was the whole difference between this house and the world, that here a mistake was mended by making someone warmer, not someone smaller. She thought, all the same, that she should go. That was the dignity of it, and she could not put it down. She had been asked to stay, by a duke in a library, with a door left open, but she had been asked in the first heat of fright and gratitude and a sleepless dawn, and Clara Ainsworth had not survived 11 months of closed doors by mistaking a generous impulse for a settled choice. She would not be a thing he kept because he had been frightened. She would not be Honoria's debt paid to a child by housing the child's friend. If she stayed, it would be because she was wanted clearly, in the cold light, by a man who had slept on it and not changed his mind, or she would not stay at all, and she would go back to the references and the softening folds and the long road with her head level, because a woman who keeps her dignity keeps the one thing the world cannot foreclose. So 3 mornings later, with the road open and the worst of the snow gone to gray slush in the park, Clara packed the small battered carpet bag in the plain attic chamber, folded her dove-gray muslin and her thin black shawl, set the gate candle last upon the washstand, and went down to the great hall to take her leave of Renmore with her chin lifted and her eyes bright and dry, having decided that she would make him say it twice, in daylight, sober or not say it, and let her go. He was waiting at the foot of the great staircase. He had dressed with care, the navy tailcoat with its subtle embroidery, the cream waistcoat, the high white cravat, like a man who had thought about a morning and decided to meet it properly. And in his hand, held out toward her as she came down with her carpet bag, was the gate candle lit in its tarnished pewter chamber stick. She stopped on the 3rd stair from the bottom and looked at it, and understood that he had gone up to the attic himself to fetch it, and that he meant her to see he had. "You gave me this at the gate," she said, "when you thought I was someone else." "I did." He did not lower his arm. Beside him, gripping his coat, and then, as Clara came down, reaching up to seize her free hand with the fierce, silent grip of a child who has decided not to lose one more person, stood Ba, speaking now, smiling sometimes, holding Mrs. Tibbs against her chest. "I gave it to a stranger I mistook for my governess. I am offering it now to Clara Ainsworth, whom I do not mistake for anyone, and have not for some days, having slept on it twice and risen each morning more certain than the last. I have no rank-given right to make you stay. You have shown this whole household what it is to keep your dignity when you have nothing else, and I would not take it from you for the world. So I am not commanding. I am asking, plainly in daylight, as you have taught us all to do. Stay, not as a servant, not as a debt, not as a kindness owed to Honoria, as yourself freely, because this house is warmer with you in it, and the child speaks, and I, God help me, have begun to live in my own home again. Take the candle, or do not, but know that I am asking the second time, sober in the cold light, exactly as you required without ever saying so, because I have learned to read you, Miss Ainsworth, and that is a thing I never managed with anyone before." Clara looked at the candle, and the child's hand in hers, and the good plain face of a man who had asked twice. The dignity she had been guarding so fiercely did not require her to refuse a thing offered, clearly, in daylight, with nothing hidden on either side. It had only ever required that she not be taken for granted, and she had not been. She set the carpet-bag down on the stair, and she reached out and closed her cold hand around the warm pewter of the chamber stick, over his, so that for a moment they both held the single candle between them, as they had at the gate. Only now she was not freezing, and he was not mistaken, and the child was holding on and not letting go. "I will stay," said Clara Ainsworth, "as myself, and you may keep your rank. I find I prefer you for the things it cannot buy." The dry flicker at the corner of his mouth became at last a full and easy smile. "There," he said, "is the plain speaking I have come to depend upon. Welcome home, Miss Ainsworth. It is enough to say that the rest came slowly, as the best things at Renmore came, chastely, with reserve, a careful arm's length closing by inches over weeks and seasons. The references sent for and arrived, the aunt thawed to a dry and loyal ally, the county's coldest duke seen, to its astonishment, to laugh. But that is another winter's telling. This one ends where it should, on a single evening some weeks on, when the snow had come again, soft and unhurried, to fall past the tall windows of the warm drawing-room. The light was going. Dusk came blue and gentle over the white park, and the candles were lit against it, one by one, until the room held its own small amber weather. Bea, 22 years younger than the woman she had reached for, and would never lose again, 7 years old and finally, wholly a child, slept curled in a deep burgundy chair with Mrs. Tibbs under her chin, watched over by Mrs. Holland, who knitted by the fire and pretended not to dab her eyes. Hollis had come up from the stable with a mended bridle and a gruff word about the black horse being gentler since the lady stayed. Lady Margaret read by the candelabrum, and once looked over her spectacles at the pair by the window, with something that, on a less guarded face, would have been a smile. And at the window stood Julian and Clara, she 22, in a cream gown a little finer than the dove-gray she had come in, her dark auburn hair softly dressed, he with his hand resting lightly over hers on the cold sill, watching the snow fall over the park that had nearly killed her, and had instead, by way of a banging gate and a sheltered flame and a mistake he never corrected, brought her home. On the ledge between their hands, the single beeswax candle burned, the same candle, lower now and steadier than ever. Its small warm light held up against the blue cold of the glass, and beside it, where Bea had set it, lay the worn cloth doll, keeping watch. Outside, the snow. Inside, the fire and the candle, and nowhere in the whole white world either of them had to be. Some doors opened by mistake. The warm ones, you learn, were the ones you were walking toward all along. So, I will leave you with the only question that matters. On a snowbound night, with a candle between you and the cold, when the wrong name is offered to you by a kind hand at a gate you never meant to reach, would you take the warmth and let the mistake stand, or would you tell the truth into the snow and walk on with your dignity unspent? Stay by the fire a while and decide which kind of brave you are.